The temperature inside Ezekiel Thorne's cabin measured 68 degrees, while the blizzard outside raged at 30 below zero. Other trappers who visited that winter night stood on his sleeping platform and felt warmth radiating through the wood. Beneath their feet, something no frontier cabin had ever achieved before. Before we dive into how one trapper's obsession with heat changed frontier living forever, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten wilderness innovation move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The water bucket had frozen solid. Ezekiel Thorne stood in the doorway of the cabin, staring at the thick layer of ice that covered what had been liquid water just 8 hours earlier when he and Absalom Hayes had left to check their trap lines. The fire in the stone hearth still held coals, glowing faintly red beneath a layer of ash. He had banked it carefully before dawn, using techniques he had learned over 6 winters in the Montana wilderness. The coals should have kept the cabin interior warm enough to prevent freezing. They had not. Absalom pushed past him into the cabin, carrying an armload of firewood he had split from their stockpile outside. His breath formed thick clouds in the frigid air. "Fire's still going," he said, nodding toward the hearth. "How's the bucket frozen through?" Ezekiel knelt beside the fireplace and added wood to the coals, blowing gently until flames appeared. The fire built quickly, crackling as it consumed the dry pine. Heat radiated from the hearth, warming his face and hands. But when he stood and stepped back just 5 feet from the fire, the cold returned immediately. He walked to the bucket and knelt beside it, placing his hand on the dirt floor. The earth was frozen hard as stone. "Cold settles," Absalom said, crouching to warm his hands at the fire. "Always has. Can't fight it." Ezekiel had known this truth for years. Every trapper knew it. Heat rose. Cold air sank, and no amount of firewood could change the basic reality that cabin floors remained brutally cold even when fires burned hot. Men slept on raised platforms or piles of pine boughs to get themselves off the frozen ground. They wore every piece of clothing they owned to bed. They woke with frost on their blankets and ice in their beards. This was simply how winter worked in the mountains. But something about seeing that frozen bucket bothered Ezekiel in a way it never had before. They had left a good fire. They had been gone less than a full day. The cabin was well built by frontier standards, with tight chinked logs and a solid roof. Yet the interior had dropped below freezing despite their precautions. He thought about how much wood they burned each winter just to maintain barely tolerable conditions. He thought about the nights when cold woke him despite exhaustion, forcing him to rebuild the fire at 2 in the morning. He thought about how much time they spent managing heat instead of doing productive work. Absalom was already rolling out his sleeping blankets on the platform they had built along one wall. "Get some rest," he said. "Lines'll need checking again before sunset tomorrow." Ezekiel added more wood to the fire and lay down on his own bedding. The warmth from the hearth barely reached the sleeping platform. By midnight, he knew the fire would die down and the cold would return. This was the rhythm of winter survival. This was simply how things were. He did not know that in 4 days, everything would change. The storm hit on the 3rd night after they found the frozen bucket. Ezekiel woke to wind howling through gaps in the cabin walls he thought he had sealed properly. Snow was forcing itself through cracks he could not see in the darkness, creating small drifts along the base of the walls. The fire had died to barely glowing embers. He rose immediately and built it back up, but the wind created downdrafts that fought against the flames. Absalom was coughing. Not the occasional throat-clearing cough of a man with cold air in his lungs, but deep rattling coughs that shook his entire body. Ezekiel turned from the fire and saw his partner sitting upright on his bedding, wrapped in both of his blankets, shivering violently. "How long you been coughing?" Ezekiel asked. "Since midnight, maybe." Absalom's voice was rough, strained. "Can't get warm." Ezekiel added more wood to the fire until it roared, consuming their carefully rationed supply at an unsustainable rate. The heat barely pushed back the cold. He could feel frigid air pouring across the floor like invisible water, pooling in the low areas, rising only when displaced by direct heat from the flames. Absalom lay back down, curling into a tight ball beneath his blankets. The storm continued for 6 days. Snow piled against the cabin walls until it reached halfway up the door. Temperatures outside dropped so low that spit froze before hitting the ground. Inside, Ezekiel burned wood constantly, maintaining the largest fire the hearth could safely hold. It was not enough. Absalom's condition worsened rapidly. The coughing became continuous, exhausting him until he could barely speak. Fever set in on the 2nd day of the storm. By the 4th day, fluid had settled in his lungs, making each breath a visible struggle. Ezekiel did everything he knew to do. He kept the fire burning at maximum output. He piled every blanket and fur they owned onto Absalom's shaking body. He made hot broths from their dried meat supplies and held his partner's head up so he could swallow. Nothing helped. The floor remained frozen. Cold air continued settling into the lowest parts of the cabin, no matter how much heat rose from the fireplace. Absalom spent 6 days lying on a platform barely 3 feet above ground that felt like it was made of ice. On the morning of the 7th day, the storm broke. Brilliant sunlight streamed through the cabin's single, small window. The wind had stopped. Absalom Hayes was dead. Ezekiel sat beside the body for an hour, watching light move across the frozen floor. The fire had finally died down to coals. He could see his breath in the cabin air. He placed his hand on the platform where Absalom had died and felt wood so cold it hurt to touch. Something fundamental shifted in Ezekiel's mind in that moment. Absalom had not died from lack of fire. He had died despite constant fire, killed by cold that no amount of traditional heating could overcome. Ezekiel buried Absalom on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had trapped together for 3 seasons. The ground was frozen solid, forcing him to build a fire on the burial spot and let it burn for hours before he could dig. The work took an entire day. He marked the grave with stones arranged in a cairn that would survive spring flooding, and he stood there until darkness fell, not praying exactly, just standing in the cold. He returned to the cabin alone. Everything Absalom had owned remained exactly where he had left it. His traps hung on wall pegs. His spare shirt lay folded on the shelf. His rifle stood in the corner. Ezekiel left it all untouched and began an investigation that would consume the next 4 months. He started by studying the fire itself. He built fires of different sizes and observed how heat moved through the cabin space. Large fires created intense heat near the hearth, but the warmth dissipated rapidly with distance. Small fires burned longer, but provided even less warmth to the far corners of the single room. No matter the fire size, the floor remained cold. He spent hours lying on the frozen dirt with his face near the ground, trying to understand cold air movement. He could feel it flowing like water, pouring down the stone walls, spreading across the floor, pooling in corners and low spots. Heat from the fire rose straight up and escaped through the roof or chimney. The cold air simply replaced it at ground level, creating a continuous cycle that no amount of burning wood could break. Ezekiel began visiting other trappers' cabins within 2 days' travel. He told them he was checking on people after the storm, which was partially true, but his real purpose was studying how they managed heat. Every cabin showed the same pattern: roaring fires that warmed the air near the hearth while floors remained frozen. Men sleeping on elevated platforms covered with piles of furs and blankets. Ice forming on interior walls despite continuous burning. He talked to a French-Canadian voyageur named Baptiste, who had spent 20 winters in the mountains. Baptiste showed him a technique of hanging blankets from the ceiling to create a smaller, heated space around the fire. It helped, but the floor was still frozen. He visited a German immigrant named Klaus, who had built a second, smaller fireplace in his cabin, thinking 2 fires would solve the problem. Both fires burned constantly. The floor remained cold. The pattern was universal and apparently unsolvable. Heat rose, cold air sank, and frontier construction offered no solution. Men simply accepted this reality and adapted by using more blankets, burning more wood, and accepting that winter meant being cold most of the time. But Ezekiel could not accept it. Every time he returned to his cabin and saw Absalom's empty bedding, he thought about those 6 days watching his partner die from cold, despite a fire burning constantly just 10 feet away. Spring arrived in late April. Ezekiel completed his trapping season alone, working twice as hard to cover the trap lines he and Absalom had managed together. The work kept him moving, kept his mind occupied, but every evening, when he returned to the empty cabin, the question returned: how could heat be made to go down instead of up? How could warmth reach the floor where men actually slept? In early June, he loaded his winter's collection of beaver pelts onto 2 pack horses and began the journey to Fort Benton. The trip took 12 days through mountain passes still choked with late snow. He arrived at the fort on a Tuesday morning and sold his furs to the trading post for a fair price. Most trappers would have spent the next few days drinking, gambling, and enjoying civilization before heading back to the wilderness. Ezekiel went directly to the blacksmith shop. The smithy was operated by a man named Garrett, no relation to Josiah, who had learned his trade in Pennsylvania before coming west. He was working on a wagon wheel rim when Ezekiel arrived, heating iron in a coal forge until it glowed orange, then hammering it into shape on an anvil. Ezekiel stood watching, mesmerized by how heat moved through the metal. "You need something made?" Garrett asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "No," Ezekiel said. "I need to watch you work. I'll pay for your time." Garrett stared at him for a moment, then shrugged. "Your money." Ezekiel spent 6 days in that smithy, paying Garrett $2 per day just to observe. He watched how iron was heated, shaped, and cooled. He saw how heat transferred through metal with remarkable efficiency compared to stone or wood. He observed that iron retained heat long after being removed from the forge, radiating warmth steadily as it cooled. On the 3rd day, he asked Garrett about pipes. If you heated one end of an iron pipe in a fire, would the other end get hot? Garrett nodded. Iron conducts heat right through. That's why blacksmiths use tongs. Touch a heated iron bar anywhere along its length, and you'll burn. How far would heat travel through a pipe? Depends on the pipe diameter and how hot the source fire burns. But heat'll travel as far as the iron goes. Metal wants to equalize temperature along its entire length. Ezekiel asked about pipe availability and costs. Garrett explained that cast iron pipes were expensive on the frontier, shipped upriver by steamboat from foundries in St. Louis. A 4-inch diameter pipe, 6 feet long, cost $12. That was nearly a month's worth of provisions for a trapper, an enormous expense for a single piece of metal. "What would someone use a pipe like that for out here?" Garrett asked. "I'm not sure yet," Ezekiel said. Ezekiel left Fort Benton in late June with supplies for the coming year and one item that made every person who saw it question his sanity. Strapped across his pack horse was a cast iron pipe, 6 feet long and 4 inches in diameter, weighing nearly 70 pounds. He had spent $48 on the pipe and an additional $8 on sheet iron, fire clay, and tools that Garrett said might be useful for metalwork. More than half his fur money went into materials whose purpose he could barely articulate. The journey back took 15 days because the pipe's weight slowed his horses considerably. He stopped at 3 different trapper camps along the way, needing to rest the animals. At each stop, men saw the pipe and asked questions. "Building a stove?" asked a trapper named Dutch Henry. "Something like that," Ezekiel replied. "Awful long for a stovepipe, awful heavy too. You could have got sheet metal and rolled your own for a quarter the cost and half the weight." Ezekiel did not explain because he could not fully explain even to himself. He had an idea forming, built from observations about heat rising, cold settling, iron conducting, and men dying on frozen floors despite burning fires. The idea was not complete yet, but it required this pipe. Word traveled fast in the sparse mountain community. By the time Ezekiel reached his cabin in mid-July, 3 trappers had already stopped by to see if the rumors about Thorne's iron folly were true. They found him beginning construction on a new cabin 200 yards from the one where Absalom had died. "What's wrong with the old cabin?" asked Josiah Garrett, who trapped the territory 15 miles south. "Everything," Ezekiel said, digging a foundation trench with methodical care. Josiah watched him work for an hour, seeing how Ezekiel measured and remeasured every dimension, how he rejected stones for the foundation that were not flat enough, how he consulted drawings he had sketched on a piece of birch bark. "You're building different," Josiah observed. "I'm building a cabin that won't kill a man in winter." "Absalom died from pneumonia, not from the cabin." "Absalom died from cold," Ezekiel said, not looking up from his work. "The cabin couldn't keep him warm. This one will." Josiah looked at the iron pipe lying near the construction site. "That pipe's going in the cabin somehow?" "It is." "Where? How?" "Under the sleeping platform. It'll carry heat from the firebox to where a man actually sleeps." Josiah was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed, not cruelly, but with genuine amusement. "Ezekiel, heat rises. That's just nature. You can't make it go down through wood and warm a bed. You're going to bury that expensive pipe in the ground where it can't do anything useful, and you're still going to freeze next winter." "Maybe," Ezekiel said, "but I'm going to try." Word spread through the scattered trapping community over the next month. Trappers made excuses to pass by Ezekiel's construction site. They saw the elaborate stone foundation with its built-in firebox chamber. They saw the careful measurements and the unusual design. They began calling it Thorne's foolish furnace and the hotbed experiment. Some thought grief had affected Ezekiel's mind. Others thought he was wasting time and money on superstitious nonsense. Ezekiel ignored them all and continued building with obsessive precision. The foundation took 3 weeks to complete, far longer than any trapper would normally spend on such work. Most mountain cabins sat directly on the ground or on a few flat stones to keep logs off the dirt. Ezekiel was building something entirely different. He started by excavating a rectangular area 12 feet by 16 feet, removing soil to a depth of 8 inches. The excavation had to be level within a finger's width across its entire surface. He checked it repeatedly using a water-filled trough he had constructed specifically for this purpose, adjusting high spots until the bottom was perfectly flat. Along one short wall of the excavation, he built a firebox chamber using flat stones he had selected from the creek bed. The chamber was 2 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and 18 inches tall. The stones were fitted together with clay mortar mixed from creek bank, clay, sand, and water. He shaped each stone individually to minimize gaps. The firebox had an opening at the front for feeding wood and air intake, and an opening at the back where the iron pipe would enter. The pipe would rest in a stone channel that ran the length of the cabin, elevated 4 inches above the excavation floor. Ezekiel built this channel using flat stones set on edge, creating a trough that would hold the pipe securely while allowing air to circulate beneath it. The channel stones were mortared in place and carefully leveled. At the far end of the cabin, opposite the firebox, he built a small stone chamber with an opening to the outside. This would serve as an exhaust port, allowing smoke and spent heat to escape while creating a draft that would pull heat through the entire length of the pipe. The exhaust design was critical. Too much draft would pull heat through too quickly. Too little would cause smoke to back up into the cabin. He spent 2 full days adjusting the exhaust opening size, testing different configurations by building small fires in the firebox and observing smoke movement. He finally settled on an opening 6 inches wide and 8 inches tall, angled upward to encourage draft without creating excessive pull. Around the entire perimeter of the excavation, he built a stone wall foundation 2 feet high. These walls would support the log walls of the cabin itself. The stones were selected for their flat surfaces and stacked with clay mortar between each layer. Every stone was tested for stability before the next layer was added. Inside the stone perimeter, he filled the excavation with smaller stones and gravel, creating a layer that would insulate the pipe channel from the ground below while providing a stable base for the sleeping platform he would build above. The fill material was packed tightly, with gravel filling the spaces between stones. The result looked absurd by frontier standards. Ezekiel had spent 3 weeks and used approximately 4 tons of stone to build a foundation for a cabin that should have taken 3 days total to complete. Visiting trappers saw the elaborate stonework and the carefully constructed firebox and exhaust chambers and shook their heads. "You're building a monument, not a cabin," said a trapper named William Spence. "I'm building a cabin that works," Ezekiel replied, setting another stone with meticulous care. Installing the iron pipe required precision Ezekiel had never attempted in any previous construction. The pipe had to rest in the stone channel at exactly the right height and angle. Too low, and it would sit directly on stone, creating hot spots that might crack the iron. Too high, and the sleeping platform above would be too far from the heat source. The angle mattered because any low spots would collect condensation that might form inside the pipe. He built wooden supports using split logs shaped to cradle the pipe's curved surface. These supports sat on the channel stones, elevating the pipe 4 inches above the bottom of the trough. He positioned supports every 18 inches along the pipe's length, distributing weight evenly. Each support was leveled individually using his water trough method. The pipe installation took an entire day. Ezekiel lowered it carefully onto the supports, adjusting position until the pipe ran perfectly straight from the firebox chamber to the exhaust chamber. One end extended into the firebox, positioned so flames and hot coals would heat it directly. The other end stopped just short of the exhaust chamber, allowing heat to radiate while smoke escaped around it. He sealed the connection between pipe and firebox using fire clay, a special clay Garrett had sold him that could withstand extreme temperatures without cracking. The clay formed a flexible seal that would allow for thermal expansion while preventing smoke from leaking into the cabin space. Around the pipe, in the stone channel, he placed selected stones that would absorb and radiate heat. These stones were chosen for their density and smooth surfaces. They were positioned to direct heat upward toward where the sleeping platform would be built, while leaving gaps for air circulation. The stone arrangement took 3 days of testing and adjustment. With the pipe installed, Ezekiel built his first test fire. He used small pieces of dry pine, building flames gradually rather than creating immediate intense heat. He wanted to observe how the system behaved before subjecting it to full temperature stress. The pipe heated slowly. Within 20 minutes, he could feel warmth radiating from the iron surface 3 feet from the firebox. After an hour, the entire length of the pipe was warm to the touch. After 2 hours, the pipe was too hot to hold a hand near. Heat radiated upward in waves he could feel by holding his palm 18 inches above the iron surface. Smoke drew perfectly through the exhaust chamber. The firebox draft was strong and steady. The pipe showed no signs of stress or cracking. The system worked exactly as Ezekiel had theorized during those long hours observing Garrett's blacksmith work. He let the fire burn down and watched how long the pipe retained heat. Even after flames died to coals, the iron remained warm for over 3 hours. The surrounding stones stayed warm even longer, releasing stored heat gradually into the space above. Ezekiel stood in his unfinished cabin as evening approached, feeling heat radiating from a pipe buried in a stone channel, and knew he had solved the fundamental problem. Heat was going down, staying down, and radiating exactly where he needed it. Building a sleeping platform above a heat source that could reach temperatures exceeding 200 degrees presented a challenge Ezekiel had anticipated but not fully solved. Wood burns at approximately 450 degrees, but it chars and weakens at much lower temperatures. Sustained exposure to heat above 150 degrees would eventually cause structural failure. He needed to transfer warmth through the platform without damaging the wood itself. He started by building the platform frame using green cottonwood logs that were naturally resistant to heat degradation. The frame sat on stone pillars he had built at each corner of the cabin, elevating the platform exactly 18 inches above the pipe. This distance was critical. Too close and the wood would char. Too far and heat would dissipate before reaching the sleeping surface. He tested various distances by building small sections of platform at different heights and running the heating system for extended periods. At 12 inches, wood showed char marks after 6 hours. At 24 inches, heat transfer was noticeably reduced. 18 inches provided the optimal balance between safety and warmth. The platform surface itself required special consideration. Ezekiel rejected standard split logs or rough planks. Instead, he spent 5 days hand-shaping boards from a single large pine tree, creating uniform thickness of exactly 2 inches across each board's entire surface. The boards were fitted tightly together with minimal gaps, creating a continuous surface. But wood alone would not solve the heat distribution problem. The pipe created a linear heat source directly beneath the platform's center. Without intervention, this would create a hot strip down the middle of the sleeping surface while edges remained cool. Ezekiel needed a material that would absorb heat from directly above the pipe and spread it evenly across the entire platform area. He experimented with various materials over 2 weeks of testing. Dry sand spread beneath the platform boards conducted heat poorly. River stones worked better, but created uneven distribution with hot spots over each stone. Gravel provided more even coverage, but did not retain heat effectively. The solution came from observing the clay mortar he had used in the stone foundation. Clay absorbed heat readily, held it for extended periods, and could be shaped to exact specifications. He developed a mixture combining clay from the creek bank with fine sand and small pebbles, creating a compound that was both thermally efficient and structurally stable. He built a shallow wooden form beneath the platform boards, creating a tray that would hold his clay mixture. The form had low sides that allowed heat from the pipe to reach the clay while containing the material. He mixed his clay compound to a thick consistency and spread it in the form, creating a layer 3 inches deep that covered the entire area beneath the sleeping surface. The clay layer took 4 days to dry completely. When Ezekiel tested the system again with a full fire, the results exceeded his expectations. Heat from the pipe warmed the clay, which distributed warmth evenly across its entire mass. The clay then radiated heat upward through the wooden platform boards, creating a sleeping surface that was warm but not uncomfortably hot. The cabin walls went up using standard log construction, though Ezekiel applied the same meticulous care to their assembly as he had to the foundation. He selected straight logs of uniform diameter, stripped them completely of bark, and fitted them with minimal gaps. The chinking between logs used his own mixture of clay, moss, and pine pitch that sealed better than traditional mud. By late September, the structure was enclosed with a roof, door, and single small window. The cabin looked ordinary from the outside, giving no indication of the innovation hidden beneath its floor. Ezekiel moved his supplies and equipment from the old cabin, leaving Absalom's belongings where they had been, and prepared to test his heating system under real winter conditions. The first extended test came in early October, when temperatures dropped below freezing for 3 consecutive nights. Ezekiel built a fire in the firebox using the same amount of wood he would have burned in a traditional fireplace. Within 2 hours, the platform surface was noticeably warm. By evening, he could sit on the boards without blankets and remain comfortable. He slept that night directly on the wooden platform with only a single thin blanket. The surface beneath him radiated steady warmth that penetrated through his clothing and kept him comfortable despite temperatures outside dropping to 20 degrees. When he woke at dawn, the fire had burned down to coals, but the platform remained warm from heat stored in the clay layer and surrounding stones. The system worked, but Ezekiel identified improvements needed. The fire burned through wood quickly, requiring frequent feeding to maintain heat output. He needed better control over burn rate and heat intensity. He also noticed that the cabin's far corners, away from the platform area, remained noticeably cooler than the space directly above the heating system. He spent the next month refining his design. He added a damper to the firebox, a simple iron plate that could be adjusted to control airflow. Restricting air slowed the burn rate, making fuel last longer while maintaining adequate heat. He experimented with different fire-building techniques, discovering that a bed of hardwood coals covered with smaller pieces of softwood provided the most consistent heat output. For the cool corners problem, he built a small stone wall around the sleeping platform that would absorb heat and radiate it outward into the cabin space. The wall was only 12 inches high, but used dense river stones that held heat exceptionally well. This addition created a thermal mass that helped stabilize temperature throughout the entire structure. He also refined his clay mixture, adding crushed charcoal to improve heat retention. The modified compound stayed warm noticeably longer after fires burned down, extending the period between wood feedings. By mid-November, he had reduced his wood consumption to roughly half what he had burned the previous winter while maintaining superior warmth. Trappers continued visiting periodically, and their mockery had evolved from outright laughter to bemused skepticism. They saw Ezekiel's elaborate system, acknowledged it seemed to work, but questioned whether the massive effort justified modest improvements over traditional methods. "You spent 4 months building a fancy cabin that's maybe a bit warmer," said a trapper named Douglas McCall. "The rest of us built serviceable cabins in 4 days." December 1842 arrived with unusual ferocity. The first major storm hit on December 4th, dropping temperatures to 15 below zero and dumping 3 feet of snow across the territory in 36 hours. Trappers throughout the region battened down, burning wood at unsustainable rates to keep their cabins minimally habitable. Ezekiel lit his heating system and settled in to wait out the storm. Inside his cabin, the temperature stabilized at a comfortable 60 degrees. He maintained this warmth by feeding his firebox every 4 to 6 hours with modest amounts of wood. The sleeping platform radiated steady heat that filled the small space efficiently. He could walk barefoot on the platform surface without discomfort. His water bucket, positioned in the cabin's coolest corner, remained liquid throughout the storm. The storm broke after 3 days, and Ezekiel ventured out to check on neighbors. He visited Josiah Garrett's cabin first, finding it barely warmer than the outside air despite a massive fire burning in an oversized hearth. Josiah had burned through half his winter wood supply in 3 days. Ice coated the interior walls. The floor was frozen solid, despite flames roaring just feet away. "How'd you fare?" Josiah asked, teeth chattering despite standing directly beside his fire. "Comfortable," Ezekiel said. "Never got cold." Josiah stared at him. "Your floor pipe thing actually worked?" "It did. Still is. Cabin's warm right now with just coals in the firebox." They visited 2 other trappers that afternoon. Both had suffered similar experiences, burning enormous amounts of wood while barely maintaining survival temperatures. Both had frozen floors, ice-coated walls, and expressions of exhausted misery from 3 days of fighting cold. Word spread rapidly. 5 trappers visited Ezekiel's cabin over the next week, and each one experienced the same revelation. They stepped through his door expecting typical frontier conditions and instead found genuine warmth. They stood on his sleeping platform and felt heat radiating through their boot soles. They touched the wooden surface and found it warm as summer sun on stone. The mockery stopped completely. These were practical men who understood survival, and they recognized immediately that Ezekiel had solved a problem they had all accepted as unsolvable. Some asked technical questions about construction methods. Others simply stood in the warmth, absorbing the reality that winter cabin living did not have to mean constant cold. Obadiah Crane arrived on December 23rd with his wife Sarah and their 3 children, ages 8, 5, and 2. They had been traveling to a settlement in Oregon Territory when early winter trapped them in the mountains. Their situation was desperate. Obadiah had built a rough shelter, but it provided minimal protection. Sarah was showing signs of frostbite. The children were constantly cold, despite wearing every piece of clothing the family owned. "We heard you built something that actually keeps warm," Obadiah said, standing in Ezekiel's doorway with snow covering his shoulders. "My family needs help." Ezekiel looked at the exhausted woman and 3 shivering children behind Obadiah and made an immediate decision. "You'll stay here," he said. "I'll help you build your own cabin with the same system." Obadiah Crane's family moved into Ezekiel's cabin while the 2 men began construction on a new structure 200 yards away. Ezekiel had supplies to spare from his preparations, and Obadiah worked with the desperate energy of a man trying to save his children from freezing. They started on December 26th, working through brutal cold to establish a foundation before the ground became completely impenetrable. The design followed Ezekiel's proven system, with modifications for a larger family. The cabin would be 14 feet by 20 feet, providing more living space. The heating pipe would be 8 feet long instead of 6, requiring 2 sections joined together. Obadiah had enough money from selling his wagon and oxen to purchase the necessary iron from Fort Benton, but winter made travel impossible. Ezekiel offered to sell him pipe sections he had acquired for experimentation. They excavated the foundation over 4 days, building fires on the frozen ground to soften it enough for digging. The firebox chamber was built larger to accommodate longer burns necessary for a family's continuous heating needs. The stone channel for the pipe was constructed with careful attention to Ezekiel's specifications, though Obadiah struggled initially with the precision required. "Why does every stone need to be exactly level?" Obadiah asked on the 3rd day, frustrated with Ezekiel's insistence on perfection. "Because uneven stones create uneven heat distribution. Your children will sleep on this platform. You want warm spots and cold spots, or consistent warmth?" Obadiah checked the stone level again without complaint. The pipe installation went smoothly because Ezekiel had refined his technique. They positioned wooden supports, lowered the joined pipe sections carefully, and sealed all connections with fire clay. The exhaust chamber was built slightly larger than Ezekiel's to accommodate the longer pipe and increased heat output. By January 10th, the basic heating system was complete and ready for testing. They built a small test fire using dry kindling and pine. The pipe heated gradually along its entire length. Heat radiated upward exactly as designed. The exhaust drew smoke perfectly without creating excessive draft. Obadiah stood watching warmth rise from buried iron and understood for the first time why Ezekiel had spent months on development. "It actually works," he said quietly. "Heat's going down through the ground and coming back up where we need it." The platform construction proceeded quickly with both men working. They built the frame, shaped and fitted the boards, constructed the clay mixture tray, and spread Ezekiel's improved compound beneath the sleeping surface. The clay required 5 days to dry in the cold conditions, so they continued work on walls, roof, and finishing details. By late January, the cabin was complete and ready for occupation. They tested the heating system for 2 full days, monitoring temperatures, checking for smoke leaks, and ensuring safe operation. The platform surface reached comfortable warmth within 3 hours of lighting the firebox. The cabin interior stabilized at 58 degrees with modest wood consumption. Sarah Crane cried when she walked into the finished cabin and felt warmth rising from the floor beneath her feet. Word of Obadiah Crane's cabin spread through the mountain trapping community faster than any news had traveled in years. By early February, trappers were making excuses to pass through the area just to see if these rumors were true. Some came skeptical, convinced that stories of warm floors were exaggerations born from winter cabin fever. They left convinced. Josiah Garrett organized what he called a demonstration day in mid-February. He rode to every trapper camp within 3 days' travel and invited everyone to Ezekiel's cabin on February 20th to witness the heating system under controlled conditions. 14 trappers arrived on the specified date, along with 3 families who had wintered in rough shelters and were desperate for better solutions. The temperature outside was 12 below zero. A bitter wind made conditions feel even colder. Ezekiel's cabin stood among snowdrifts that reached halfway up its walls. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady stream, far less than what poured from traditional fireplaces working to heat cabins on such a day. Ezekiel opened his door and invited everyone inside. The trappers entered, expecting the usual, barely tolerable warmth of a frontier cabin in deep winter. Instead, they found themselves removing their heavy coats within minutes. The cabin interior was genuinely warm, comfortable enough that men could sit in shirt sleeves without shivering. "How much wood you burning?" asked a trapper named Samuel Dockery. Ezekiel showed them his firebox, which contained a modest fire burning steadily but not intensely. "I feed it every 5 to 6 hours with about this much." He indicated an armload of split logs, perhaps 15 pounds of wood total. The trappers exchanged glances. Most of them were burning triple that amount every 2 to 3 hours just to maintain survival temperatures in their cabins. They moved to the sleeping platform, and Ezekiel invited them to remove their boots and stand on the wooden surface. The warmth was undeniable and shocking. These were men accustomed to frozen floors, to sleeping in layers of furs and blankets, to waking with ice in their beards. Standing on Ezekiel's platform barefoot was like standing on sun-warmed stone in summer. Heat radiated through the wood, penetrating skin, creating comfort that seemed impossible in 12 below zero conditions. "Where's the heat coming from?" asked a younger trapper who had never seen Ezekiel's system explained. Ezekiel described the buried pipe, the firebox chamber, the clay heat distribution layer, and the exhaust system. He explained the physics of heat conduction through iron, thermal mass in clay and stone, and the principle of directing heat downward to where humans actually needed it, rather than letting it rise uselessly toward the roof. Some trappers understood immediately. Others struggled with concepts that contradicted everything they knew about fire and heat. But everyone understood the result. They were standing barefoot in comfort during conditions that would have left them huddled against fireplaces in every other cabin they knew. Josiah Garrett produced a mercury thermometer he had brought from Fort Benton. Specifically for this demonstration, he measured the platform surface temperature at 64 degrees. He measured the cabin air temperature at 56 degrees. Then he walked outside and measured exterior temperature at 11 below zero. Within 2 weeks of the demonstration, 5 trappers had approached Ezekiel asking for help building heating systems in their own cabins. Some wanted to modify existing structures. Others planned to build new cabins before the next winter. All of them understood that what they had witnessed was not a minor improvement, but a fundamental solution to the most dangerous aspect of frontier winter living. Ezekiel agreed to help anyone who asked, but he established conditions. He would not do the work for them. He would teach them his methods, supervise their construction, and ensure they understood the principles involved. But they had to do the physical labor themselves. He also required that anyone he helped must agree to teach others who asked. The innovation needed to spread as widely as possible. The first project began in late February with a trapper named Vincent Aldrich, who had spent 12 winters in the mountains and had lost 2 toes to frostbite 3 years earlier. Vincent's cabin was well built by traditional standards, but suffered from the universal floor cold problem. Ezekiel evaluated whether the existing structure could be retrofitted with a heating system. The answer was yes, but it required significant modification. They had to excavate beneath the cabin floor, removing 18 inches of dirt while supporting the log walls temporarily with wooden braces. The work was backbreaking in frozen conditions, but Vincent attacked it with intensity, born from remembering what frostbite felt like. They built the firebox chamber against the cabin's existing stone hearth, connecting the new system to the old chimney structure. The pipe channel was constructed with the same careful attention to detail that Ezekiel had used in his own cabin. Vincent struggled with the precision required, frequently having to adjust stones that Ezekiel judged insufficiently level, but he learned quickly. The platform construction was simplified because the cabin's existing floor joists could be incorporated into the design. They added clay distribution layer, fitted new floorboards, and sealed everything properly. The entire retrofit took 19 days of hard work in difficult conditions. When they tested Vincent's system in mid-March, the results matched Ezekiel's prototype. The floor warmed evenly. The cabin interior reached comfortable temperatures with modest wood consumption. Vincent stood barefoot on his floor for the first time in 12 years and laughed with pure joy. "I've been freezing my entire time in these mountains," he said, "because I didn't know this was possible." 2 more retrofit projects began in March. New cabin construction projects were planned for spring, when ground excavation would be easier. Trappers who had mocked Ezekiel's foolish furnace 6 months earlier were now asking detailed questions about stone selection, clay mixtures, and pipe installation techniques. The innovation had a name now. Trappers called it the Thorn System, or sometimes floor pipe heating. Obadiah Crane, grateful for his family's survival, had begun calling Ezekiel's cabin the Warm House, and the term spread to describe any structure using the buried pipe method. Spring 1843 brought experimentation and refinement as more trappers adopted Ezekiel's heating innovation. Men who understood blacksmithing, masonry, or carpentry contributed improvements based on their specialized knowledge. The core principle remained constant, but variations emerged that addressed specific needs and circumstances. A German immigrant named Klaus Reinhardt, who had trained as a stonemason in Bavaria before coming west, developed an improved firebox design using precisely cut stones that created better heat retention and more efficient combustion. His firebox held heat 30% longer after fires burned down, extending the time between wood feedings from 5 hours to nearly 7. Vincent Aldrich discovered that adding a water reservoir above the pipe created dual benefits. The water absorbed excess heat, preventing the platform from becoming uncomfortably hot during extended burns. The heated water could then be used for cooking or washing, eliminating the need for separate water heating fires. His modification required careful engineering to prevent leaks and ensure structural stability, but it proved popular with families. Josiah Garrett experimented with pipe positioning, building a system where the pipe ran in a serpentine pattern rather than straight lines. This increased the heated surface area beneath the sleeping platform, improving temperature distribution. The serpentine design required joining multiple pipe sections and careful attention to thermal expansion, but it allowed larger cabins to be heated more evenly. Ezekiel documented these variations, sketching designs on birch bark and sharing them with anyone interested. He spent April and May traveling between cabins under construction, offering advice and ensuring people understood the critical safety elements. Improperly installed systems could create fire hazards or carbon monoxide risks. He emphasized proper exhaust ventilation, safe clearances between pipes and wooden structures, and regular maintenance requirements. The clay mixture evolved through trial and experimentation. Different trappers had access to different clay sources with varying properties. Some clays cracked when heated repeatedly. Others remained too soft and did not provide adequate heat distribution. Ezekiel worked with builders to develop mixture ratios appropriate for their specific clay types, adjusting sand and aggregate proportions to achieve optimal results. One innovation that Ezekiel initially resisted but eventually accepted came from a French-Canadian voyageur named Baptiste Moreau. Baptiste suggested running a secondary smaller pipe from the main heating pipe to a stone alcove built into the cabin wall. This created a warming niche where wet clothing could be dried or food could be kept from freezing. The modification used minimal additional materials but added significant practical utility. By June, 11 cabins in the territory used Thorn system heating. 3 more were under construction. The innovation had spread beyond its original purpose of survival into the realm of comfort and efficiency. Trappers discovered they could maintain warmer cabins with less wood, freeing time for productive work instead of constant fire management. Families with children found that consistent warmth reduced illness significantly. The technique was becoming standard practice rather than experimental curiosity. Men building new cabins automatically included heating pipe channels in their foundation plans. The question was no longer whether to build a Thorn system, but which variation best suited individual needs. January 1844 brought weather that tested every heating system in the territory. A massive cold front pushed down from Canada, dropping temperatures to levels even the oldest trappers could not recall experiencing. The thermometer at Fort Benton recorded 42 below zero on January 9th. In the mountains, conditions were certainly worse, though few had instruments capable of measuring such extremes. The cold lasted 8 days. Snow fell continuously for the first 3 days, then stopped, leaving crystalline air so frigid that breathing hurt. Trees cracked from expansion stress. Metal tools became brittle and dangerous to use. Wildlife disappeared completely, seeking any shelter available, and trappers huddled in their cabins, fighting to stay alive. Traditional cabins became death traps. Men burned wood as fast as they could feed fires, yet interior temperatures barely reached above freezing. Ice formed on interior walls despite roaring flames. Water froze solid within minutes of being brought inside. Several trappers abandoned their cabins entirely, seeking refuge with neighbors who had better heating. Ezekiel's cabin maintained 58 degrees throughout the crisis. He fed his firebox every 4 hours with normal wood loads. The platform remained comfortably warm. His water bucket never froze. He could work inside without wearing heavy coats, performing routine tasks while outside conditions killed unprepared animals within hours. Other cabins with Thorn systems performed similarly. Obadiah Crane's family stayed warm and safe. Vincent Aldrich reported his retrofitted cabin held steady temperatures despite wind that penetrated chinking in the walls. Klaus Reinhardt's improved firebox design proved its value, requiring even less wood than standard installations during the extreme conditions. But the most dramatic validation came from a cabin that failed. A trapper named Morris Webb had attempted to build a heating system without consulting Ezekiel or anyone experienced with the technique. Morris had observed systems under construction and believed he understood the principles. He built his own version in November, convinced he could improve on the design through his own innovations. Morris's system worked adequately during moderate cold, giving him false confidence in his construction. When the extreme cold hit, fatal flaws became apparent. He had positioned his pipe too close to the platform wood, attempting to maximize heat transfer. The intense fires needed during the crisis caused his platform boards to char and smoke. He was forced to extinguish his heating system completely, reverting to a traditional fireplace that provided an adequate warmth. Morris arrived at Ezekiel's cabin on the 4th day of the cold snap, frostbitten and hypothermic. Ezekiel treated his injuries and let him recover in genuine warmth. When Morris had recovered enough to talk, he admitted his mistakes and asked to learn proper construction methods. "I thought I understood it from watching," Morris said, "but I missed details that matter." Ezekiel examined Morris's cabin after the cold broke. The charred platform boards revealed clearances had been half what they should be. The firebox had no proper air control, forcing hot, fast burns that created dangerous temperatures. The exhaust ventilation was inadequate, causing smoke accumulation that Morris had not recognized as dangerous. Spring 1844 brought changes beyond weather. The Rocky Mountain fur trade was collapsing as beaver populations declined and fashion shifted away from felt hats. Trappers were leaving the mountains, heading to Oregon Territory, California, or back to civilization. The frontier was transforming from a trapping economy to settlement and agriculture. But the cabins remained, and new settlers arriving in the territory discovered structures with unusual heating systems that worked far better than anything they had known. Families who had planned to build traditional homesteads saw thorn system cabins and immediately understood their value. The innovation began spreading beyond the trapping community into the broader settlement population. Ezekiel found himself teaching farmers, ranchers, and merchants rather than just mountain men. These new students brought different perspectives and skills. Some were educated men with formal training who understood engineering principles intellectually. Others were practical craftsmen who grasped concepts through hands-on work. All of them wanted warm homes for their families. He developed a teaching method over multiple projects. First, students helped retrofit or build a complete system under his supervision, learning every step through direct participation. Then, they assisted another student's project, reinforcing their knowledge by teaching what they had learned. Finally, they built their own system independently while Ezekiel inspected and corrected errors. The method was time-intensive but effective. Students who completed all three stages understood not just how to build thorn systems, but why each element mattered. They could troubleshoot problems, adapt designs to unusual circumstances, and teach others reliably. Obadiah Crane became one of Ezekiel's most dedicated students, helping build 7 systems over 2 years. He refined teaching techniques, developed clearer explanations of thermal principles, and created physical models that demonstrated heat flow concepts. His family had been saved by the innovation, and he felt obligated to help others achieve similar safety. Vincent Aldrich specialized in retrofit applications, developing methods for adding heating systems to existing cabins with minimal structural disruption. His techniques allowed settlers with limited resources to improve cabins they already owned rather than building entirely new structures. Klaus Reinhardt focused on advanced firebox designs, experimenting with airflow patterns, combustion efficiency, and heat retention. His improvements reduced wood consumption further while increasing heat output. Some of his fireboxes maintained adequate warmth on a single evening wood loading that burned slowly through entire nights. By autumn 1844, an informal network existed. Experienced builders taught new students who taught others in turn. The innovation spread organically through demonstration and practical results rather than through any formal organization. Ezekiel had become known throughout the territory not as the inventor, which he downplayed, but as the most experienced teacher willing to help anyone who asked. Settlers arriving in spring 1845 found established homesteaders eager to share heating system knowledge. The technique had become standard practice within 3 years of Ezekiel's first prototype, integrated into frontier building culture as thoroughly as log notching or chinking methods. By 1846, thorn system heating had spread beyond the original Montana Territory into Wyoming, Idaho, and parts of Oregon. Trappers and settlers carried the knowledge with them as they migrated, building cabins that confused newcomers who could not understand why floors remained warm while fires burned modestly. The innovation had become self-perpetuating, requiring no promotion or advocacy, beyond the simple fact that it worked dramatically better than alternatives. Variations continued emerging as builders adapted core principles to regional conditions and available materials. In areas with abundant flat stone, elaborate thermal mass systems developed that stored heat for extended periods. Where iron pipe was prohibitively expensive, some builders used clay tile conduits that worked adequately, though less efficiently. A few wealthy settlers incorporated multiple pipe runs that heated several rooms simultaneously, creating frontier homes with comfort approaching eastern city standards. The United States Army noticed the innovation when establishing frontier forts in 1847. A captain named Robert Thayer, assigned to construct winter quarters for cavalry units in Wyoming Territory, encountered settlers using floor pipe heating and recognized its military applications. Soldiers stationed in remote locations suffered terribly from cold-related illnesses that reduced combat effectiveness and created supply problems. Thayer consulted with Obadiah Crane and Klaus Reinhardt, learning construction methods and adapting them for barracks use. The Army's adoption brought unintended consequences. Military engineering documentation of heating systems included proper attribution to civilian innovators. Official reports mentioned Ezekiel Thorne by name, describing his original 1842 prototype and subsequent refinements. These reports entered Army archives and were later referenced in engineering manuals, creating a permanent historical record of the innovation's origins. Mining camps in California and Nevada adopted heating systems after prospectors from Montana brought the knowledge west during the gold rush. Mine buildings and assay offices used modified versions that provided warmth in structures that traditionally had been miserably cold. The technique proved particularly valuable in high-altitude mining operations where extreme cold limited working seasons. Trading posts and way stations along emigrant trails began advertising warm floor cabins to attract travelers. The phrase became shorthand for quality construction and proprietor competence. Emigrants who experienced such accommodations often sought to build similar systems when establishing their own homesteads. Educational institutions took notice. A school teacher in Oregon Territory named Margaret Ashford wrote a detailed description of floor pipe heating principles for a teacher's journal, explaining how the system demonstrated practical physics concepts. Her article reached educators throughout the Western Territories, some of whom incorporated heating system construction into practical education curricula. By 1848, the innovation had evolved beyond its original survival purpose into a standard frontier building technique with broad applications. The phrase, "built with thorn warming," appeared in property advertisements and settlement promotional materials. What had begun as one trapper's obsessive response to tragedy had become an established technology that improved thousands of lives across multiple territories and diverse applications. Ezekiel Thorne left the mountains in late summer 1848. He was 37 years old, had accumulated modest savings from trapping and occasional carpentry work, and felt ready for a different life. The wilderness that had challenged and nearly killed him no longer held the same appeal. He wanted land he could farm, a community with schools and churches, perhaps eventually a family. He sold his cabin to a young couple from Ohio who were establishing a ranch. They had heard about his heating system from neighbors and were eager to own the original prototype. Ezekiel showed them maintenance procedures, explained the principles behind various components, and left them with instructions written on careful hand on preserved birch bark. The cabin would remain occupied continuously for the next 23 years. His journey to Oregon Territory took 6 weeks, traveling with a small wagon train of families heading west. He helped them build temporary shelters each night, sharing knowledge he had accumulated through years of frontier living. Several families asked about floor pipe heating, having heard rumors of the technique. He sketched designs and explained construction methods around evening campfires, planting seeds that would grow into more warm cabins in new locations. He purchased land in the Willamette Valley in October 1848, 80 acres of partially cleared ground near Salem. The property had a rough cabin that he immediately began improving, though he did not install a heating pipe system. The valley's mild climate made such elaborate heating unnecessary. He built a standard fireplace and focused instead on farming infrastructure. Ezekiel married in 1850 to a widow named Catherine, who had lost her husband to cholera during the overland journey west. She had 2 young daughters who needed a father, and he welcomed the ready-made family. They had 2 more children together over the following years, building a quiet life centered on farming, community participation, and raising children who would never know the harsh mountain existence their father had survived. He rarely spoke about his time in the mountains or the heating innovation he had developed. When neighbors asked about his past, he acknowledged he had been a trapper, but offered few details. The tragedy of Absalom's death remained too personal to share casually. The years of obsessive work that followed seemed almost embarrassing in retrospect, though he never regretted the effort. Occasionally, travelers from Montana or Wyoming would recognize his name and ask if he was the Thorne who had invented floor pipe heating. He would confirm his identity but deflect credit, emphasizing that many people had contributed improvements and that the innovation had succeeded because it solved a real problem. He kept no records of his original work and made no attempt to profit from his invention through patents or licensing. Catherine once asked why he did not seek recognition for creating something so valuable. Ezekiel thought carefully before answering. "I built it because Absalom died," he said finally. "Recognition would feel like celebrating his death. I just wanted people to stop freezing."